Hey everyone. We might just sort of begin. Can everyone hear me all good? All good. Cool. Thanks for coming and participating. I was definitely feeling like this issue was being really swept under the rug, and yeah, Zoom is such an awesome platform to just finally get together and discuss some of these things. Yeah, so thanks for coming. Like to start by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional owners of the land that I'm speaking from here in Avalon, and pay my respects to those past, present, and emerging in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community. For those of you who don't know the Green Team, we're a volunteer youth run environment organisation from Northern Beaches. And last year, we decided that we wanted to do more talk series. So this is sort of part of that kind of program. Yeah, just some house rules for the call. When the panelists are speaking, if everyone could just keep their microphone on mute, because we'll have question times around 7. And also there's no pressure if you don't want to have your video on or anything like that. The way we'll do questions is if you have a question, just raise your hand and then unmute yourself. And if your video's off, you can just write in the little chat here, or there's also a little, I think it's a reaction section, and you can pop your hand up through that. Yeah, just type in the chat if you've got any problems. Yeah, so we're really grateful to have the New South Wales Greens member and spokesperson for mining, Abigail, here. And also we've got Dr. Stuart Khan, Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering from UNSW. Yeah, so they're on the little, if you want, you can go to gallery view or speaker view. I prefer gallery view, I think. Yeah, so the reason we've all joined together tonight is to talk about the Woronora Reservoir coal mining project that was approved at the end of March by the Berejiklian government. Tonight we'll hopefully unpack some of the implications of this mine and the controversy surrounding it passing during the coronavirus pandemic. Yeah, so I think if we pass over to Abigail, and then Stuart, if you'd like to just sort of take over where she ends, and then we'll sort of roll into questions after that. Cool, thank you.
Awesome. You can hear me okay? Awesome. So yeah, I'm Abigail Boyd. I'm a Greens MP in the New South Wales Upper House. I'm the Greens spokesperson for mining and coal, as well as for about 9 other portfolios. I'm joining you tonight from Terrigal on the Central Coast, and I begin by acknowledging that I am sitting here on stolen land. The Central Coast is the land of the Guringai, Awabakal and Darkinjung peoples, and this land was, and always will be Aboriginal land, and sovereignty was never ceded. Thank you, Lucy and the Green Team, for asking me along to this discussion tonight, and to all of you here for your attendance. It is nice in gallery view being able to see everyone. I hope everyone is doing okay in the midst of COVID-19. Unfortunately, once we find our way out of this crisis, we'll of course still be in the midst of the climate crisis. But I'm hopeful that we emerge from the coronavirus crisis more determined than ever to build that kind of society where we can live within our ecological bounds, and where the well-being of everyone in our society is prioritised ahead of short-term profits and interests. But we're going to have a fight on our hands. While we've been, quite understandably distracted by COVID-19, the fossil fuel lobbyists and the developer lobby have been really busy. They've been working on our governments to fast track some really damaging and environmentally destructive projects. And that pretty much began with the news about the approval for Peabody Energy to mine beneath Woronora, and that happened in mid-March. Although it wasn't well known until a couple of weeks afterwards. And it happened, as you already know, just before a petition signed by over 10,000 people was due to be debated in Parliament, which is a real slap in the face to the community that will be impacted by the decision. So in these opening remarks, I'm going to talk firstly about the political landscape or the vibe surrounding these recent mining approvals. Secondly, a bit about the Woronora mine and the similar fight we've been having here on the Central Coast in relation to the Woronora 2 coal mine, also a longwall mine proposed for underneath our catchment. And then I'll finish up by talking about the problems we have at the moment being able to actually, shine a light on government actions and what we can do to fight these mining approvals together. So it seems like a really long time ago now, but actually it wasn't that long ago when we were all focused on bushfires and drought. And we were seeing a growing awareness of the need to firstly protect our water, and secondly, the need to act to avoid further devastation from climate change. And you could sense this real shift in public understanding and sentiment. And the fossil fuel industry and some members of government were acting like they understood that the tide was turning against them and against that pro-coal agenda. And I had a few meetings in Parliament on a couple of different bits of legislation where the government was pretty lacklustre in its defence of some of the more environmentally unfriendly things that they were proposing, and I was still disappointed by the eye rolls every time I mentioned climate change in the chamber. But I felt like a little bit of a shift in understanding that business as usual couldn't continue when it came to coal. The Territorial Limits Bill, which was the one that Barilaro wanted to use to stop consideration of climate change in planning decisions, that was put forward before the bushfire season and pretty much not heard of again. I sat on an inquiry in relation to that bill, again, kind of a lacklustre defence of it, and the inquiry recommended that the bill didn't proceed. And again, we haven't heard anything from it since. So just a few months ago, we were reading about whole towns going months without drinking water, and about the runoff from burnt bushland that was actually, the water was running down and taking the ash with it and contaminating rivers, including, an impact on the Woronora Dam and the catchment area around that. And we're also hearing of more fish kills from that as well. So that's only a few months ago. And the truism that, water is life was finally getting some sort of traction and understanding. So there's, 40 or so new mines or expansions going through the New South Wales approval process at the moment, as well as the really large Narrabri coal seam gas project that we're keeping an eye on. And all of them were looking a bit more shaky than they had done for a while. As for Peabody's Woronora mine, Water New South Wales had already stepped in to caution against mining in the water catchment quite sensibly. And we were using that report to help us campaign here on the Central Coast in relation to the Woronora 2 coal mine, which is another, as I said, longwall coal mine, thermal coal mine that's threatening our water catchment. The community here has been fighting that coal mine for over 20 years, with at one point even the Liberals promised to stop it on the basis that it was really too risky for the drinking water that over 300,000 residents rely on. Unfortunately, the Liberals reneged on that promise after they won the election. So very disappointing, but back in 2011, they understood that mining underwater catchments was a bad idea, or at least it seemed like they did. So what is so bad about longwall mining in our catchments? I'm sure that Trevor will have a lot more to say about this, but longwall mining presents a risk to both the quantity and the quality of water catchments. Coal mines, they use a hell of a lot of water, and we've seen some really good reports on that just this week, actually, about the extent of the water that they use. And then there's the subsidence and the risk that poses. So as, and again, I'm sure others could explain this a lot better than me, but just briefly, as cracks open up from the subsidence, water gets lost into the void below. And also the water can surface with heavy metals that then get carried downstream and can threaten the sort of the local river ecosystem, as well as eventually, potentially the reservoir and the catchment itself. And there's also another contamination risk from this bizarre idea of recycled mine water, which I'll come to in a little bit, and I would be interested in other people's views on that concept. So I guess, how do these mines get approved when they present such a risk? There's a few things going on here from a regulatory perspective, but fundamentally, it's very difficult not to approve a mine in New South Wales under our legislation. That's how bad our Mining Act is. Now, I grilled Barilaro about this in the context of the Woronora 2 coal mine during some budget estimates. And he actually said that the Mining Act was about protecting the mining industry. I was a bit surprised. I thought that perhaps the Mining Act would at least attempt to balance interests, environmental and social, against the profits of mining companies. But no, he made it very clear that the Mining Act was about protecting the mining industry, and that the New South Wales government was keen on New South Wales being an easy place for mining companies to mine. So, and it's certainly, the Act is certainly written that way. So as long as a mining company pretty much can accept the conditions on the license that it's given, and those conditions are designed to somehow address the risks, it's really hard for the mine not to proceed once it gets past a certain point. The Woronora 2 coal mine, for example, has over 200 conditions on the license. And as is the same for the Woronora mine, there's a bunch of conditions in relation to water that actually require the mining company itself to monitor and report on its own compliance with those conditions. So one of the Woronora 2 coal mine conditions allows the mining company to release water that it's used in its mine back into the water catchment, directly back into the water catchment, using technology to clean that water to a certain standard, when that technology has not actually been developed yet, and no one's sure whether it can actually be used effectively. And we've seen attempts at doing that in other places have really bad consequences. So nevertheless, they got given that license on the basis they could meet that condition once they're up and running. What if it all goes wrong? Then it's really the community that bears the cleanup cost. The New South Wales Auditor General over a year ago now highlighted just how inadequate the bonds are that coal mining companies and gas companies give to the New South Wales government. And they're a fraction of what it would actually require to remediate a mine, let alone deal with something unexpected. So if Peabody goes under, their bond is really unlikely to cover the cost of remediation. And that's assuming that remediation of the environmental damage is even possible. It's not always possible, even with the greatest will in the world and quite a lot of money. Sometimes things are wrecked forever. So there's a lot of trust that the New South Wales government gives to the coal mining industry, particularly when you consider just how poorly resourced our EPA is in terms of staffing as well as general funding and powers. It doesn't have the powers it used to have. So now with Parliament effectively shut down, our options to intervene or hold the government to account for these decisions are pretty limited from a parliamentary perspective, but also from the perspective of community groups getting attention on these issues from media and the general public. Because we're all distracted with COVID-19. And as I said, that's really understandable. And people shouldn't be taking advantage of that. So we've been running a campaign calling for a halt to approvals of major planning projects. And that would include coal mines, until a plan is developed to allow meaningful community consultation during the COVID restrictions. So timelines for consultation needs to be lengthened, timelines for getting submissions in. We need adjustments to be made to allow real participation, not just being able to view hearings remotely, but actually participate in the process. But ultimately, it's a lack of community interest and awareness that will allow the government to push through these really unpopular decisions while people are dealing with COVID. And when they can't be scrutinised for those decisions in at least, till at least September, when Parliament resumes. So we're going to push for an earlier return to Parliament, but in the meantime, it's up to all of us to spread the word about these mining projects and what it means, and to keep up the pressure on our local politicians by writing emails. They're still receiving their emails, even if they're not sitting in their offices. They're definitely still receiving emails and still receiving phone calls. And those things really make a difference. They hate getting those calls and receiving those emails. So it's always a good thing to do that. My colleague, Kate Fairman, who is the Greens spokesperson on water, is also working hard on this issue. So together, we're coming at it from the two different perspectives, but we're both focused on the danger of longwall mining to the water catchments. And we'll keep doing what we can to raise awareness of just how stupid it is to mine under our water catchments. Yeah, thank you for everything that all of you are doing to raise that awareness too. I know there are people on this call who have been campaigning on this issue for a long time. And, since the bushfires, we have seen local community groups reaching out to each other and really fighting side by side on similar issues across the state. So when we had a Woronora 2 protest outside Parliament, we had a lot of activists from other communities experiencing similar threats to their environment from coal mining coming along and joining and adding their voice. And I think that sort of cross collaboration between different community groups is really powerful. So I hope I haven't gone for too long. Thank you again for having me here tonight. It's a real pleasure, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Okay, so I believe I'm supposed to take over, which I'll do. I did want to show a couple of slides if I could, so I'll just, I think that'll work, hopefully. That's not what I wanted. Good. Does that show some slides? Yep. All right. So I'm Stuart Khan, and I'm a professor in the School of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the University of New South Wales. And following on from Abigail, I'll run through some of the issues that we know about and what really some of the big uncertainties are as well around what can happen to water quality in a drinking water catchment as a consequence of longwall coal mining that's going on within that catchment. So I won't spend any time talking too much about Sydney's water supply system, only to say that, we often talk about how Woronora Dam is 80% of our supply, and so Woronora Dam's very important to us, but we're starting to understand more and more about the importance of the southern dams, Woronora, Cataract, Cordeaux, Nepean, and Avon Dam that supplies Wollongong, but is also interconnected with the Sydney system. For example, when we went through the bushfires recently, we had ash and sediment running off into Woronora Dam. We had water quality problems there that would have caused a major water quality crisis for a city like Sydney, except for the fact that we were able to avoid it by being able to draw on other parts of our supply system. So being able to pull water up from the southern dams via the upper canal, even being able to take water out of Prospect Reservoir. So that whole interconnectedness is important, and even the smaller storages are very important to provide the flexibility and therefore the resilience in a drinking water supply that a big city like Sydney needs. As most people would know, we have a protected catchment, which means that around our big water storages, or around most of our water storages, we have what are called in legislation special areas. So those special areas are areas that are specially protected. There are parts of those special areas that you can't go into without express permission. And there are other parts of the areas, wider parts of the areas, where particular activities are controlled. So there's lots of things you can't do in those special areas, bushwalking, camping, driving a four-wheel drive. However, longwall coal mining is not on the list. One of the things that when we look at how we manage those special areas and we look at how we manage Sydney's drinking water catchments, a key piece of legislation is the state environmental planning policy from 2011 on Sydney's drinking water catchment. And in particular, there's an item within that policy, part 2, number 10, that refers to development, sorry, I'm reading the wrong one. I think I'll put the, oh no, that is right. Development consent cannot be granted unless neutral or beneficial effect on water quality. So this is a test that is there within that planning policy that says that if we want to approve something to occur, including coal mines, we need to be able to demonstrate or plan for not a negative impact, a neutral or beneficial outcome on water quality. And that will be interesting to see how that goes in an upcoming assessment that I'll talk about. So the particular coal mine that we've started talking about today is this one under Woronora Reservoir, which is operated by Peabody Energy. They already operate a number of longwall coal mines around parts of Woronora, and this is the Waratah rivulet along here that I'll show you some pictures of. So one of the inflows to Lake Woronora or Woronora Dam, and the proposal that has just been approved is for expansion of 3 new longwalls here, which actually are underneath parts of the reservoir itself. Most of the, I think all of the existing approvals have been sort of on the periphery, but even those have significant impacts. There's also existing or previous coal mining activity around Lake Cataract. And there's this one which is now under discussion, under consideration further south at Dendrobium Colliery, which is a colliery that is in between Lake Cordeaux Dam and Avon Dam. So there are a number of parts or number of areas here as they've been described that have been approved for longwall coal mining. They refer to Area 1, Area 2, and then this big area here, Area 3, parts A, B, and C. The current activity is in here, Area 3, Part B, Area 3B, where there is longwall coal mining going on at the moment, but now there is a new proposal to extend those activities out to these new areas, Area 5 and Area 6. So this is Area 3 here, so moving out towards the ends of the reservoirs, and in fact getting close now to the Cordeaux River and the Avon River after the water has left the reservoir, after it's left the storage. And in fact, you can see the dam walls are in here. This is the dam wall for Cordeaux. The dam wall for Avon is here. And these dam walls are a concern now for Water New South Wales in terms of potential risks and impacts to those dam walls, which of course would be catastrophic if those dam walls were to fail. But that's a risk that has now been highlighted by Water New South Wales in response to this particular proposal. So Water New South Wales are currently opposing this proposal, which is unusual. It says something in itself. I mean, it's not unusual. They've proposed mining operations in the past, but to have a government agency effectively very forthrightly opposing very forthrightly opposing a proposal to the government, to the New South Wales government at this point, I think is very significant, and it shows that they've identified that their responsibility is to manage the risks and manage water quality in the catchment, and this has come along and they've identified it as a significant risk that does need to be highlighted. They've raised risks, and we'll talk about issues around surface water loss, fracturing of some of the streams, the bedrock in some of the streams, issues around water quality, and issues to their infrastructure, including the dam walls and including some of their potential operations in the future where they're interested in being able to take deeper water out of Avon Dam, for example. And these opportunities to provide that additional drinking water might be compromised in the future. Some of the things that occur that we'll talk about, and we'll look at a few pictures I just wanted to make the point quickly that these are not necessarily things that go wrong. This isn't if there's been a stuff up and something unexpected happened. So this is a risk assessment from one of the proponents, the Russell Vale project that was in one of the previous slides, written by the mining company or their consultants as the risk assessment, looking at what could occur, what could be expected to occur as a consequence of their longwall mining activities. And so when they look at risk, they look at the likelihood of risks and they look at the consequences. And A here under likelihood stands for almost certain. So even before a project begins, the mining companies identify things like surface fracturing causing cracking of bedrock as almost certain. This is part of the deal. This is what we can expect to occur if this project goes ahead. They've also identified things like reduced base flow to stream, so loss of water as an almost certain risk, changes to what's going on underground, and leading to, again, to loss of water and reduced flows into those reservoirs as almost certain. So both water quantity and water quality outcomes are known and understood before the projects go ahead. And that's how you end up with stories like this one from the ABC. Dendrobium mine found to have damaged waterway but complies with license conditions. This is actually part of the deal. You can be fully compliant. They haven't done anything wrong, but the waterway is damaged. I'll talk through some of these details. So when we think about water quality impacts, what's actually happening, as Abigail described, is you have a longwall mining operation down below the reservoir. It might not be immediately underneath it. It might be within the vicinity of the reservoir or the catchment itself, the streams that run into that reservoir. They pull out the mine, they pull out the coal, they leave a void there. There is no process for somehow refilling that void. It remains open. And eventually, during the mining, or much more likely after the mining has left, you start to get subsidence. The void will collapse. So the heavier material from above will collapse down to fill that void. And as it does, it'll work its way up to the surface and you get subsidence and movement happening at the surface. And some of the outcomes from that can relate to water quality. It can relate to some of the chemicals that end up dissolved in the water. And that's because you get big cracks like this. This is the Waratah rivulet at Woronora Reservoir. You get large cracks, you get potholes that no longer fill up because they're cracked beneath and the water is moves underground. And when you have cracks, this is sandstone. Sandstone's made of lots of different minerals, including things like iron and manganese, sodium, carbonates are all present, and it weathers. So it normally would weather very, very slowly on the surface, but when you crack a sandstone rock, you expose new rock that hasn't been exposed to weathering before. So you've got a lot more soluble materials, a lot more soluble minerals there that can suddenly be dissolved when the next water comes along and covers that surface. And that's effectively what happens. So we pick up things like iron and manganese through these types of cracks, and we end up with water quality impacts like this. So again, you've probably seen pictures of the Waratah rivulet, where you've got a combination of dissolved minerals here, iron and manganese, but you've also got a lot of bacterial growth. There are types of bacteria that consume iron and consume manganese, and also contribute to the visible water quality impacts that you see here. So this is the water that now flows into Lake Woronora. There are parts of the Waratah rivulet. This is one pool on the rivulet which had been notoriously able to maintain some water in it. Even during the Millennium Drought, this particular pool held water. But this photo was taken about 4 years ago now, showing that when we visited on this particular occasion, the cracking and subsidence that had occurred had led to a complete draining of pools that never drained previously. The mining company Peabody has made some efforts to remediate some of these cracks. So they filled cracks with various substances, including some that are effectively look like concrete, others that are polyurethane. So this is a polymer. It's pretty much polyfiller that you can buy at the hardware store. And you can see, I don't know if you can tell, that this is not the natural rock here. This is all this polyurethane filler all around up in this area here where it's been squeezed into the cracks to try and seal up the cracks in the water catchment. We don't really know how effective that's been, but it's unlikely to be completely effective. And the other issue that we see here, when you have cracks going on, you've got coal underneath, there is methane, there is coal seam gas. And we do see methane bubbling up. And as we walked down I went on a tour with Water New South Wales a few years ago, as we walked down the Waratah rivulet, there were many cases that you could see methane bubbling up through those cracks, just as you've seen other pictures and footage of people setting streams alight, etc. It's the same issue where you have a flammable greenhouse gas being emitted through our drinking water supply. And I thought this one was interesting because this article had been written at least 5 years before when I visited and took photos of methane bubbling up. It was written in 2011, and a spokesperson from Peabody saying, well, that's to be expected, of course. Once you get subsidence, you get movement and cracks, you'll start to leak methane. It will probably take 3 to 4 months to stop. And that was evidently inaccurate, in that it was 5 years later that we were there. And my understanding is that even now you can visit and see methane bubbling out of these systems. So that's all I've got. It's a rush through some of the big issues around water quality and around how longwall coal mining below the catchment can present risks, but they go beyond risks in that they are understood and accepted and part of the deal for what we should expect as a consequence of approving these activities in our drinking water catchment.
Thank you. It's so interesting. I'm just going to pass on for anyone that has questions. Just raise your hand. Or if there's, I think, is that Ali? You sent us some email questions as well. I might just start off with some of these questions she emailed in, which is, I think, directed to, we've sort of covered it. How does longwall mining differ from other mining, and specifically what part of the river does it? That was your question, Ali. Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like I've got a good understanding. Sorry, my internet's dropping out, and I'm sorry if it's bad connection. But I do have a subsequent question for Stuart. Stuart, on your first slide, it showed Woronora Dam, and it looked like it was not really connected to anything else. Is that correct, or is that just how the design of your slide was set up?
No, so Woronora is a little bit different to most of the others, in that Woronora is the supply to the Sutherland Shire and the northern parts of the Illawarra around, I think, Bundina, Helensburgh, and those. It's not the Bundina is not the Illawarra, but that part of Sydney. So it is a separate part that's not interconnected to most of the supply for Sydney. But in many ways, that makes it more important because it's a sole source for that particular area. The Sutherland Shire can take water from Prospect Water Filtration Plant through the bigger system, but it's via a very small pipeline, I think, that comes down under Tom Ugley's bridge, or one of the bridges. And there's no way that could supply that whole community now for any length of time. So they're very much dependent on that one source.
Okay, thank you for clarifying. I do live in the Sutherland Shire.
Right.
Exactly. So I'm sure everyone would.
Bit of lag there, I think. I don't know if we lost you there, Ali. Sorry, we lost what you said for the last sentence. Does anyone else have any questions? Yeah, okay. Can you unmute yourself there? Yeah.
Thanks very much for the presentation, Stuart, and great to see you, Abigail. As Abigail knows, and maybe Stuart knows, I live about a block away from the Russell Vale mine. So I've got a question about their latest proposal. I'm just wondering if Stuart has any opinion on that. Russell Vale's latest proposal is, and just for people listening, Russell Vale mine is mining in the vicinity of the Cataract Reservoir. And their latest proposal is not longwall mining, it's actually first workings, bord and pillar. But one of the issues is that on either side of the proposed mine area, there are inactive mines, the old Cordeaux and the old Corrimal mine. And so while bord and pillar may not expect to use a lot of be as destructive as longwall mining, there's potential for water to leak from the old mining workings on either side, and also the potential for pillar collapse in the Bulleye seam, which is the top seam of coal, which was mined many years ago. Russell Vale mine wants to mine a third seam of coal. So it's not longwall mining, but to us it seems very, very destructive and quite risky. Stuart, I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on that proposal.
I don't really know. I don't have any expertise in mining itself. I've only paid attention to mining because of its impacts and risks to drinking water catchments. But no, I think it sounds like all of the risks that you're identifying make sense to me. I'd be interested to know whether or not that is a proposal that is going to end up with the expert panel on mining. I don't think they have looked at it. Is that the case? Maybe Abigail would know, but it seems like it is something that would certainly should go through that panel, and we should have some expert advice on it.
Yeah, thanks. I think it will go through the panel. Yeah. Thanks.
I've got a question for Stuart, if I may.
Yep, sure.
Firstly, apologies, because I think I called you Trevor when I was talking before.
You did, but that was funny.
I'm so sorry. Trevor Khan is a MLC in the New South Wales Parliament, and I don't know why. Yes. Anyway, I won't tell him I was thinking of him. So my question really is around this condition on the Woronora 2 coal mine and the this idea of recycling water, and whether you've seen that in other places, and what that really means in terms of I guess whether it's possible to do that safely, and how we could monitor them to make sure they do it safely.
Yep. So I don't know anything about the particular proposal, but yes, I have seen water being effectively treated and reused from other mining sites, and I can send you some information. There's a fairly well-known and well-publicised example in South Africa where they make a big deal out of the fact that they can treat what's very contaminated water and treat it to a very high level, and they reuse it as part of their urban drinking water supply in that case. So it's not unprecedented. I don't know what the proposal is in this case. You mentioned that the technology is not yet approved yet. It's hard to imagine them using anything other than reverse osmosis membrane filtration for that type of project. So in that case, if that is the case, assuming it is, the technology does exist. It is something that can be picked up off the shelf and with a little bit of piloting applied to most types of water quality. But I would think the bigger concerns, if that's the case, is how are they going to manage the brine? When you use reverse osmosis to treat water, you don't get rid of the contaminants. The contaminants still exist. They just get concentrated into a smaller volume, and then you have a real disposal problem. And that's usually the source of the biggest problems, or the biggest challenges in terms of coming up with some sort of sustainable management solution. We would have that problem with our seawater desalination plants if they weren't right on the coast, where they just discharge the brine straight back into the ocean. Yeah,
right. Okay, thank you. I'll go back and have a look again. That does sound like what they're using. They won't need to do it for 10 years, apparently. They've got 10 years to work it out. until then they can just take the water. So yeah, interesting. All right. Yeah. Thank you.
I'll just pop you on mute, Catherine. Wait. Oh, there you are.
Hi. Thanks. Sorry, I've been fidgeting all the time, so it's probably really hard to tell that I'm putting up my hand. Thank you so much, Abigail. Thank you so much, Stuart and the Green team, for putting on this talk. It's fantastic. I just had a question for Abigail. Abigail, you put through the Central Coast Water Protection Bill last year, and both Labor and the Liberals, and I think the Shooters, voted against it. I don't know if One Nation voted against it, but oh goodness me. I noticed that you've reintroduced that bill, and I read somewhere that you thought that it would get up this time because of changes that have been made. When do you think that will come up? Before it's going in the upper house? And can I ask, if that's okay, what you think will persuade them this time to act differently?
So I don't think at the moment the numbers are any different. I think the idea was to show them that we haven't given up. So I think what was really disappointing was to see Labor vote against it, because they were outwardly in favour of it, and it's actually based on a bill that they put forward themselves in 2018. So it's, and they used some pretty poor excuses to vote it down. I understand that politically they just don't think it's the right time for it. So the strategy behind putting the bill back in was to really have it there to focus community campaigns, so we can be campaigning for Labor to basically get on board, but also so that we're ready for if Labor does have a change of heart at some point. And so I think, yeah, we'll see. I can keep it on the books until the next election, and then we can see. But I think just having it there and having that threat for the mining company as well, knowing that it's, that it's not the end of it, was what that was about.
We went to see one of the upper house and Labor MLCs about Woronora, and he thought we were from the Central Coast. He said, "Oh, didn't we vote on that last year? Didn't we vote on that last year?" It's kind of frightening, yeah.
It's all
after the petition with 10,700 signatures, they knew about it, and they still didn't we vote on this last year? Yeah.
Yeah, they both start with W. I think that that's the. I mean, it's, when we first brought that bill, and with all the campaigning around it, we went from a bunch of people who didn't know anything about Woronora to suddenly understanding what it was, and then subsequently confusing it with Woronora. But you have to just keep trying with them. But unfortunately, Labor are hopelessly divided internally on strategy when it comes to coal, and so it's a very tricky issue for them as a party, but hopefully we'll get them there eventually.
Thank you, Catherine. I'll just unmute you, Margaret. 1 second. There you are.
Yeah, I've got a question for Abigail as well. In the Illawarra, we have nothing but ALP members, and that's one of the reasons why we tend to get ignored by the Liberal government. Is it possible this bill that you're saying, it said that the ALP put forward themselves, and also the Greens bill, is it possible for that to be posted somewhere so that we can lobby our local Labor Party politicians? I'm a member of Power. People, oh gosh, what does Power stand for? POWA. And so if somebody could send through that information, that'd be really helpful for us in our campaign down here in the Illawarra.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. I think there's a like the strategy is slightly different when it comes to the Central Coast mine because they're not covered by Water New South Wales, whereas the Illawarra is within that sort of Water New South Wales jurisdiction. So the purpose of the Woronora 2 bill on the Central Coast was to give the drinking water catchment some protection, so some additional protection, I guess. So it's slightly different, but I think there's certainly a lot of things we can do once Parliament returns to begin to focus people's attention on Woronora as well. I think that's something that my colleague Kate Fairman has in mind as well. But we can certainly send through the more details about that if that's helpful.
Kay, did you have another question, or was that a hand from before?
That was my hand from before.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
My virtual hand.
Yeah. Does anyone else have any questions? Catherine? Yeah.
I can ask a question. Has Abigail, have you or perhaps anybody else here had any luck with the unions? The CFMEU, did I get that in the right order? You know who I'm talking about anyway. I mean, clearly they're worried about jobs at the expense of our environment. You know, given it was May Day just the other day, and there were all those that great video, I don't know if everybody else saw it, about Jack Mundy and the BLF and the Green bands, and Labor were there promoting it. I saw it on a couple of their Facebook feeds. You know, it's kind of ironic that we're now in a position where we're having to fight for clean water, fighting to protect our water. And I was just wondering if you or anybody else here have had any luck lobbying the CFMEU, or, you know, whatever, in whatever order their acronym goes. Yeah.
My personal view is that, firstly, the answer is no. I haven't had any luck getting them to change their stance. But I do feel for them, because I think it was a mistake of Labor not to present a proper just transition plan. And I know that just transition has got a bit of a bad connotation to it now for some reason, and Labor has dumped the whole idea. But I think you can't just tell a bunch of people that you're going to close an industry. There needs to be a structured plan on a community specific basis as well, where you can say to people, job for job transition. We'll take you from this job, we'll skill you, we'll upskill you or reskill you into this alternative job. And if you don't have that, and if it's just a case of we either have coal or no coal, it puts the CFMEU in a really difficult position. And I think that's I think that was a major failing. And I know that Labor have not taken that as the lesson from their election loss, but I wish they would, because I think if they actually presented an alternative where we could move towards that just transition for workers, that we would be having a very different discussion right now. So I think there is a message for unions, and I think that involving unions in those transition plans and working closely with them and community is the way to actually move communities across. And I know that Newcastle is doing that in a lot. I guess despite the lack of leadership from politicians, local community leaders have been taking that transition project on and having a bit more success. But yeah, maybe someone else has something else to say.
Margaret's got her hand up, but she's on mute.
I think you're unmuted now.
Sorry, I'm unmuted. I'm unmuted now. A couple of things about that. One of the problems we have faced down here in Wollongong is that mentality of the local community is all about coal and the steelworks. I don't know whether people are aware of the 2015 campaign to save the steelworks, where BlueScope threatened to close down the steelworks unless they got what they wanted, which was basically sacking a whole lot of workers, getting workers to take lesser conditions and that sort of thing. And the community came in behind that, Save Our Steelworks campaign. So we know all about the CFMMEU and the sort of things that they do. However, the South Coast Labor Council has a thing called the Green Plan. It was written in 2011, I think, but they revamped it, brought it out again around about 12 months ago, when the demonstrations in Wollongong around the climate change were getting bigger and bigger all the time. And so that's interesting. And it does talk about it, just transition for workers. So, and having sort of recently, a friend of mine did some interviews with quite a lot of coal miners. They're not unaware of climate change. They're not silly, but they do still find that they want to keep their jobs. But unfortunately, the unions are not prepared to come out strongly against that. And so, I think the idea of a just transition hasn't actually gone away. And so I think I wouldn't dismiss it. So, yeah.
Can I say something there? Or am I on mute?
No, you're not on mute.
Oh, good. I was. In Sydney.
Can't see you.
Please, we can't hear you.
Well,
hang on, Billy, your connection's kind of bad. Did you want to type the question maybe?
Try now. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
So at the climate change demonstrations in Sydney, the MUA had they were up on the stage and they had a really strong message and presence there. And they're part of which I can't say the letters either, the union we were just talking about, which is amalgamation of a number of them. And they seem to, maybe if one goes back to each individual union and not take it as the whole, we might have a better chance, because MUA jobs are still on the line if they, especially when we were looking at it at Adani, because there was a lot of shipping, boating, transport. So, but they were still protesting against it. So maybe if it's not the whole of somebody say the letters CM, I can't say it, but you actually go back to the base, the unions that were there before they amalgamated, we might have a better chance of getting some response from them. That's all I have.
Madeline, do you have a question?
Yep. So this, Abigail, you mentioned that the act, whatever the act was, it was actually protecting coal mining. That's a pretty major barrier. What's the point of trying to make a case against each particular license coming up when there's an act against you? Are there any moves afoot to get the act changed so that we protect the environment? And, well, okay, put the environment aside, too hard, but water. Everyone needs water. Even Liberal people, voters need water.
Yeah. It reminds me of when we were dealing with the drought at the end of last year, and there were whole towns that were without drinking water. I said in Parliament at one point, what would this be like if it was the eastern suburbs that didn't have water? You know, do you think we'd actually get some action then? And of course we would, right? So this is as close as it will get to the eastern suburbs. This is actually Greater Sydney Reservoir. You would think that would be enough to pique their interest. The Mining Act is up for review, but all the time that the Liberals, the Liberal National Party have power, there's very little we can do. So in the upper house, the numbers have changed since the last election, where we do have a bit more say over a few things, but not when it comes to environmental stuff, unfortunately. So if it comes to, you know, anti-privatisation or government accountability, calling them to account for something, we will likely get One Nation on board, or we'll get the shooters and fishers, and that will be a sufficient number for us to block things coming from the government in the lower house. But on environmental issues, especially coal mining, we don't have the numbers. So when you're still dealing with a minority in both houses who are actually in favour of common sense, it is incredibly difficult. So every time, you know, a lot of people have spent a lot of money taking decisions to court, but the government at the end of the day can just change the legislation to allow these things to go through when they want them to. So until we change the government, or at least make them understand that the majority of the community is against what they're doing by making more noise, it is a very, very difficult thing for us to do, unfortunately. We have to keep trying.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, you're off mute.
Oh, goody. Thanks. Okay. You'll all be pleased to know that Randwick Council just passed a motion against this the other night successfully. So people in the eastern suburbs do care. City of Sydney Council passed a motion against Woronora as well as Sutherland Shire Council. And I think people in the local government association as a whole are looking into this at the moment. So I don't know if you can do anything up there, Abigail. You sound like you've got the council people on side up there. And I think other people here who are involved in councils can perhaps push that, because it does need pushing. It means writing to councillors and lobbying them and saying, please do something about this, and trying to get something done that way. But just on Madeline's point about the Mining Act and the law and so on, Stuart might understand the details of this more than I do, but I understand that the Water Act is subordinate to planning. Now, it's clearly stated in the Water Act that, you know, Water New South Wales is required to protect and enhance the water supply. And Stuart, I was interested in that slide you put up before from the state planning something or other. I can't remember what it was. It said neutral or beneficial, and I'm just wondering about the difference between that and protect and enhance. But clearly those planning instruments and the legislation is still subordinate to the Mining Act and the Planning Department. Is that correct? I just don't understand how they actually do that. You know, it's contradictory, and yet they still seem to get away with it. So, yeah.
So I'm just a modest engineer. I can't tell you about the legal details. Probably Abigail might have some ideas about that. But the neutral or beneficial impact is the test. And for as long as Sydney Catchment Authority have been around, they were established after the cryptosporidium incident in Sydney in 98. As long as they were around as the Sydney Catchment Authority and now Water New South Wales, that's been the test that they've used both internally in their operations, and it's been the test that's been applied since or in accordance with the 2011 environmental plan to assess whether or not most activities can occur in the catchment. So it will need to be formally assessed. This dendrobium expansion, I think, is the first mining activity that will come under that requirement. So it will be a test of that particular, a test of the application of the mutual beneficial test. And I don't think anybody knows exactly how they will put forward evidence that they will be able to meet that requirement.
I'll just chime in on the legislation to give a very unhelpful answer. So I don't really know. I'd have to go and have a look at the interaction between those different acts. But I think fundamentally they are so broad and delegate so much power to the planning authorities that it's pretty. I would say it's deliberately opaque and difficult to understand where they actually get their powers from and how to then challenge those powers. So yeah, in terms of local council, I say I'm so heartened by local councils. I think as a whole, they are a much more progressive set of organisations than our parliamentarians, and the local council on the Central Coast has stood against the Woronora 2 coal mine forever, and has actively actually put money into legal challenges and actively campaigned against it. And I know that there's been a lot of really good stuff done with the sort of coordination between the different local councils, putting up a whole bunch of really good progressive climate change related and social equity related proposals. So that's a growing network of people on the progressive councillors who are working together to get those things through, and that's fantastic because every time they do that, they raise awareness in their community. And although we might be at odds with our government of the day, that it gives me hope that we have progressive councillors doing good stuff on this. So yeah, it's good.
Madeline, I think we might make this the last one just because we're running over, and then we'll finish up there, guys.
Yeah, thanks very much, Lucy. So Abigail, it's interesting that you brought the legal aspect into it, because that was actually the comment and question I wanted to ask now. I'm sure people are aware of the EDO, the Environmental Defenders Office, and they've had some notable wins representing communities and making a legal case for things like the right to land, the right to use land. Does anyone have a comment on maybe, because I agree, recently the councils that have started voting against these mining licenses, and big kudos to Catherine for the big push that she's done down here in the Sutherland Shire Council. But could they form some sort of coalition and be the clients of the EDO and call the EDO in to stand up against the Act and say this Act is becoming unlawful in the future we're moving into?
I'll just have a quick comment on that. I think I agree with you. I think those legal actions can be really powerful, and they can, if nothing else, they're a thorn in the side of the mining company, and they can, sort of discourage the mining companies from continuing. What bothers me is how quickly the government can move to change the law retrospectively, and we saw that with Barilaro and those territorial limits bill that he put through, which hopefully is dead now, as a reaction to Rocky Hill and Byalong. And I think so yes, legal action is great because it can cause delay, it can cause expense for the mining company, It can get investors nervous. So it's good for all of those reasons. And you can have wins. And by the time it's come through the court system, you can then be looking at a different scenario where the mining company might not want to go ahead anymore. And so buying time like that is really useful. But all the time, the politicians can then retrospectively change it. Yeah, it comes back to that point again that we need change at the political level, and that requires greater awareness. And this is why this kind of thing is so great. But we just need to keep talking to each other and talking to people who don't know about this. And with that kind of political pressure, hopefully we will finally get them to change their stripes, I guess.
Cool. Thank you everyone for coming along tonight, and huge thank you to Stuart and Abigail. Yeah, thanks guys. We'll end it here, and
Thank you.
yeah, cool. Thanks guys.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks very much.